Good morning and welcome to St. Ignatius, to our year-end annual retreat that we're having online. Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce Father Collins, who will be giving the retreat for us, he's graciously agreed to do it. I would just like to say a few words about the year. It's been a challenging year for all of us, and amidst all of the challenges and the trials and all of that, we have hope. We have hope. God has given us grace and blessings. The church is open. We have two masses now at 12:30 and 4:30, at 12 o'clock and 4:30, I'm sorry, as well as all the other masses in other languages. Our church is open. We're grateful for that. We're grateful for God's grace and blessings in this trying time. And we've had this tradition of the year-end retreat for many, many, many years, and we're able to do it this year online rather than in person. So again, we thank you for joining us. I would like to introduce Father Daniel Collins, S.J. You may recognize him, know him from the church outside. One thing I really am looking forward to is when the weather gets warmer and Father Collins is outside sitting in his chair between the main chapel and Xavier Chapel, reading or talking to parishioners or just being there for us. I look forward to seeing that again. Okay, thank you. Before coming to St. Ignatius, Father Collins taught English for 35 years at Sophia University in Tokyo. With the 13 of those years he spent as president of Sophia Junior College, and for 4 years he was president of Seibo Junior College in Kyoto. Prior to coming to St. Ignatius, he served as spiritual director of the diocesan seminary in Nerimaku. Throughout his spiritually rich experience, being a missionary in Japan, Father Collins has given inspiration, counseling, and guidance to countless young minds and others here at St. Ignatius and various places in Japan. Now at St. Ignatius, he dedicates himself to the ministry of confession, which we are very grateful for that sacrament. While giving God's forgiveness, he reconciles us with God and one another. Today, the topic will be the Examen, and it's appropriate for today's retreat. It enables us to examine our relationship with God and others as we prepare for the sacrament of reconciliation at the end of this year, and prepare ourselves for the new year. So my brothers and sisters in Christ, I would like to welcome Father Collins. Thank you so much, Father, for joining us, for being here. Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you, Doug, very much. This is a fairly unnerving experience for me, in the sense that I have always given retreats, but it's always in the presence of the retreatants. And consequently today, since there is no presence of retreatants other than the virtual presence, I find it, well, we'll just see how it goes. That's all I can say. The topic, the history of the Examen. Probably the examination of conscience is a fairly common ascetic tool in the Catholic Church. Traditionally, we can trace it back to Socrates, who made the point that an unexamined life is not really a life. And I think he has a good point. So it's not just a matter of deep spirituality, it's also a matter of human psychology involved as well. However, it's not just psychology. That's the important thing. As you know, St. Ignatius of Loyola, who started the Jesuits, before he was even a priest or a founder of the Society of Jesus, he was a soldier. And in the course of a battle in northern Spain, he was wounded. A cannonball got to his leg. And as a result, he was forced to have surgery. And by the same token, he had a long time of recuperation, of getting better. And as you know, you're healing an injury, there's not much you can do except wait for time to do what it does. And in the course of that recuperation, he found that he wanted something to read. And so he was staying in his brother's castle in the course of getting better. And he asked for books. Well, all the books that were on hand were basically spiritual books. Lives of the Saints, Lives of Christ. Many of these were just simply pious hagiography. But one of the curious things that he found was that after reading these books, after some of the books, he felt very, very good. After other of the books, he felt very, very depressed. And that caught his curiosity. Why is it that after reading some books, I am depressed, and after reading other books, I feel elated? Why is that? This was the beginning of what has come to be known as the discernment of spirits, which he takes up in quite some detail in the spiritual exercises. And so the examen of conscience is a spin-off, if you will, of the discernment of spirits. The discernment of spirits is a rather, what shall I say, it's not a common experience. You don't discern spirits every day. The examen of conscience you do every day. You should do every day. I think it's good to realize that the examen of conscience is always, with no exception, always in the context of a life of prayer. If you are not praying, forget about the examen of conscience. If you are not praying, you can examine your conscience as often as you like, and it will never turn out to be what Ignatius meant by the examen of conscience. The reason I say that is that sometimes, for example, the obvious illustration is Ben Franklin, the early American pilgrim. He set about getting better, as it were, making his life more virtuous. And what he did was he said, all right, this week I'm going to work on love of my neighbor. And so he would examine his conscience in that sense every day to see if he had loved his neighbor. And if he did, he was in the plus side. If he didn't, he was in the debit side. And so it turned out to be a mathematical or a mechanistic way of Ben Franklin looking back on his life, his daily life. The examen of conscience in the Ignatian context is not that. There's nothing mechanistic about the examen of conscience. Now, I admit, if you go to the spiritual exercises where the examen of conscience is first put forward by Ignatius himself, it can be construed as that kind of an examen. Just tick off the good things and tick off the bad things and measure them up and see who's winning the battle, as it were. But that's not really what it is. When I was a novice, as all Jesuits did, we were given beads a little gimmick with beads on them, and you kept it inside your cassock, inside your soutane. And when you did something good, at least what you thought was good, you put it there and you tipped one of those beads. And on the contrary, when you did something that you were not so good, you went in there and you turned down the bead. That's not the examen of conscience. Ignatius explains it. It can be construed that way, but it's not what it is. The examen of conscience is a much more spiritual thing. To give you some examples, I'm sure that all of us, it is just a normal day, nothing extraordinary. We meet people, we do things, we hear things, we say things. In other words, we live a very ordinary life. Fine. It's the ordinary life that needs to be examined. And so, after I spoke to this person, after I heard what this person had to say, after I did this, or after I neglected to do that, how did I feel? Now, you want to be careful here because we don't want to just get into the emotion. Emotion is important in all of our psyches. But the examen of conscience is not simply an emotion. There will be disappointment, there will be anger, there will be joy, there will be hope, all of those things, which are good, perfectly normal. But the examen of conscience looks at how is the Spirit working in my life. This opens up a whole new vista of theology, at least in my mind. As you know, here we are at the end of the year. We just finished celebrating Christmas, the Nativity, which was the incarnation of the Word of God become man. And that feast is, in a sense, the foundation of Christianity. Fine, good. However, this Word become man suffered and was killed because of what he was. However, he was also resurrected because of what he was. And he left his spirit. This is the important point. When the historical Jesus was crucified and the resurrected Christ rose again, Christ went to the Father. Now, we always talk about the right hand of the Father, and that's an interesting point, whether it's the right or left hand. But that's beside the point. When the risen Christ went to the Father, he left the Spirit. Well, by definition, you cannot see a spirit. If you think you're seeing the Spirit, you've either had too much to drink or you're working on some other reality. But you cannot see a spirit. If you can't see a spirit, how do you perceive the Spirit? Can you hear him? No, you can't hear him. Can you touch him? Can you shake his hand? No, you can't do any of that. Well, what can you do? You can examine your conscience. You can see how the Spirit is functioning, working, showing up, whatever verb you want to use, in your daily life. And so it's important, I think, that we stay in contact with the Spirit, not just in this ascetical tool known as the examen of conscience, but in our prayer life. For good or bad, the prayer of the Spirit has been, in a sense, sidetracked in the charismatic movement. Nothing wrong with that. However, it's not just that. A prayer of the Spirit, a prayer to the Spirit, a prayer with the Spirit is not necessarily charismatic. So please don't think that I am advocating that you join the charismatic movement in order to examine your conscience. I'm not. But you have to be in touch with the Spirit to examine your conscience. And so if you look at your ordinary daily life, you see these human relationships, things that are said, things that are heard, things that you perceive. And you start to get the sense of what is moving me in my life. I'm sure all of us have had the experience that after a day, a very humdrum day, you feel blah. There's just nothing happened. Well, that's an unexamined life. There's never a day where you should feel blah. Because if you're living in the Spirit has no blahness about him. It's important, I think, that we learn to get in touch with the Spirit in our everyday life. And as I say, the only way you can perceive the Spirit is through examining his work in your life, in what you do, in what you say, in what you feel, all of those things. Of course, we're touching on the sacramentality of life. One of the reasons that the Catholic Church is set apart from other congregations is that we come down hard on sacramentality. Every Christian believes in the baptism. I think every Christian probably believes in the Eucharist in some form or another. But not every other Christian believes in other sacraments. As you know, Trent, the Council of Trent, they decided that there are 7 sure places where we can attain grace. And they're called the sacraments. And so as a little boy in the catechism, you learn baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, priesthood, all those. But the interesting thing is, Trent never decided that there were only 7. They said there were surely 7. And so we have, historically, the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. But Trent never said, and only those places will give you grace. Because there are other places. For example, reading Scripture, I think, is a very sacramental function. The sacrament is defined in various ways, and without getting too theological, it's attaining grace through a perceived reality. And all of those words are important. It's a perceived reality. Is it touched? Is it heard? Is it seen? For example, in baptism, you have water, the baptism. You see the water, you feel the water in the case of baptism. That's a perceived reality, and through that reality, the Spirit comes to us. And so in almost every sacrament, the formula that goes along with it, there's a reference to the Spirit. For example, in the absolution of the Sacrament of Reconciliation, the Spirit is always invoked. The Spirit is always called upon to be part of this healing process. And clearly in the Mass, how many times do we refer to the Spirit? So the point I'm trying to make is that the Spirit is functioning in our lives, whether it's in our ecclesiastical life, in other words, church life, or in our non-ecclesiastical life, other than church, work, family, enjoy recreation, hard times, bad times, good times, fun times. The Spirit is always there. The examination of conscience tries to, for lack of a better word, entrap that Spirit, and so we can understand how that Spirit is working in our lives. Frequently people will say, well, this seems terribly planned. The human beings today, in today's society, not just this country or that country, they want to be spontaneous. They want to be real. They want to be authentic. All of that means that they don't want to be hemmed in. They don't want to be put into a cage. There's nothing worse. I'll give you an example. I'm the youngest of 3 boys. And when I was growing up as a little boy, I was always introduced as the younger brother of Dave or Jack Collins. And they used to tee me off because I am who I am. I'm not the brother of anybody. I am the brother, but to be known that way is not. So all of us, I think, we want to be honest, authentic, yourself. The examen of conscience does not militate against that. On the contrary, the examen of conscience, it brings out your individuality. It brings out you and the Spirit and the interaction between the two of you. So, more concretely, how is the Spirit functioning in my life? I'll give you another example. It's a funny one, at least for me. I was ordained 50 years ago in Japan. And after ordination, I went back to the States, to my hometown for the first time as a priest. And I had gone to a parochial school and a high school run by sisters. And so they perfectly naturally asked me if I would please say Mass for them in their convent. And so I said, sure. So I said Mass every day there. And it came along towards the end of my stay there, and the superior came to me and she said, Father, you know, you're from Japan. Wouldn't it be nice if you said a Mass in Japanese? I said, yeah, well, you know, nobody would understand it. She said, that's beside the point. Just to hear it. So I said, okay. So the next day, the last day, I said Mass in Japanese. After Mass, an old sister comes wheeling up in a wheelchair. And she said, oh, Father, I'm so grateful. I've not heard a Latin Mass in years. In other words, whether it's Latin or whether it's Japanese or whether it's English, it didn't make any difference to the sister. That's precisely what the examen is. The Spirit works. Does he work in English? Does he work in Japanese? I don't know. But the examen gets you in touch with the working of the Spirit. What did you feel? You know, so often we talk about free-floating anxieties. Sometimes you wake up or you go through a day and there's just something gnawing at you. You can't put your finger on it's this or that or some other thing. But there's just an ambience which is heavy or sad or disappointing. You can't put your finger on it. The examen helps you to do that. To put your finger on what is it that is causing you this sadness, this fear, this anxiety. You say, well, that's pure psychology. In a sense, yes, but if you're in touch with yourself through prayer, it's also the Spirit at work. And so the examen of conscience, in our outfit, in the Jesuits, we're supposed to do an examen of conscience at noon or in the middle of the day, and then at night before we go to sleep. Twice a day, we look back on what happened that morning or that afternoon. Whom did we meet? What was said? How did I feel after that? You know, sometimes you can get in a crowd, and after a conversation, you just feel good. It's just uplifting. It's elating. But by the same token, sometimes you can get in a crowd, and after a conversation, you feel almost dirty. You feel oppressed. You feel that something happened there that should not have happened. The examen of conscience helps you understand what that was. And of course, not how, but that you should avoid that in the future. Or, on the contrary, when it's a good thing, how you should nurture that in the future. The examen of conscience. You can do this in various ways. Times. In other words, early in the morning, or in the middle of the morning, or at noon. You can give segments of your morning that way. You know, I had class. I was in the classroom. I talked to these people. We had this discussion. The result was such and such. Where's the spirit in all of this? How did I feel? Not was I a good teacher, not was the class interesting, but did I function as the Spirit wanted me to function? Sometimes, I'm sure all of you who've taught, you prepare and you prepare and you prepare and you teach a class and it's a real dud. And sometimes things come along, you simply can't prepare. You don't have time, you're rushed, and you go into the classroom hoping you can just, stay alive. And it's a whiz-bang of a class. Those things happen. Now, I'm not saying, don't prepare or prepare. I'm saying that whether we prepare or not, the Spirit is always working in us. If we're alive to it, if we're on the qui-vive, if we have our antennae out towards the Spirit, then we will be able to understand how the Spirit is working. So as I say, you can use times, you can use places. In my case, I'm in a Jesuit community. You can take the family, you can take your workplace, you can take recreation. You can use time, place, circumstances. With people, without people. Where is the Spirit working? How is the Spirit working? I think it's important for all of us to understand that. Okay. Coming back a little bit to the sacramental aspect of this examen of conscience. Now please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that the examen of conscience is a sacrament. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that there are sacramental times, and the examen could very well be one of those times. And so what you said, what you heard, what you saw, what you perceived, what you felt, your reaction, all of those things are tangible to you. I'm sure all of you have had difficulty sometimes. You simply cannot put into words what you're really feeling. That's all right. You don't have to put it into words. That's the beauty of the examen. You don't have to be eloquent. You don't have to be grammatically correct. You simply have to open your heart and let the Spirit, who is functioning in you, listen. As you know, St. Paul tells us in Romans that when we want to pray and we're not sure how to pray, sometimes we should just be quiet and listen to the Spirit praying within us. I think that's a very good definition of the core of the examen of conscience. Sometimes we're not sure whether what we did or what we did not do was the right thing or not. Okay. We're not assigning merit badges. We are trying to find out what the Spirit is doing or saying or acting in our lives. And so the sacramentality of the event can be any place, any time, any circumstances. But the common denominator is the function of the Spirit in our lives. Now, I said early on that if you're not in a life of prayer, that you could make an examen until the cows come home and you won't get anywhere. Because it's precisely the life of prayer, which is the Spirit, connected to the examen, which is the Spirit, that enables us to understand, or at least to grasp in some degree how God is working in our lives. Which comes to a point where we should not expect inspiration through the examen of conscience. You know, you suddenly get a great light, or you get a real insight into what Christ is expecting of you. It may come, but usually not. And don't expect that it should. All we do in the examen of conscience is listen to what the Spirit is saying to us through our actions, through our deeds, through our perceptions, through our human realities, through our situation, all of these things. The Spirit is at work, and we have to tap in on that, to tune into that, to understand what is going on. Now, recently, if I say recently, I mean within the last 30, 40 years, the examen of conscience, which is an Ignatian term taken from the spiritual exercises, has come to be known as the Examen of consciousness. This was put forward by a Maryland Jesuit, George Aschenbrenner. He's written extensively on the examen of consciousness. And it's similar to, but it's not the same as the examen of conscience that Ignatius put forward. They're not antithetical. It's not either this or that. It could be both this and that. So, how did I feel? What did I think? What was my reaction? And then you just start to see a pattern. If you do this examen on a regular basis, every day, or at least 2 or 3 times a week for a number of weeks, you start to see a pattern, how the Spirit is working in me. Not how the Spirit is working in, you know, the pandemic or the Trump succession or the latest thing in the news. No, that's completely separate. In me, how is the Spirit working? If we try to get to what the Spirit is doing every day, over the course of days or weeks or months or even years, as far as I know, there is a trend, there is a pattern. And you can point to places, I'm sure each one of us can, where there was a turning point in my life here. It may have been a disappointment, it may have been a joy, it may have been a success, it may have been a failure, it may have been a loss, it may have been a gain, but there was a turning point. Do not think that the Spirit was not there at that turning point. But by the same token, do not think that the Spirit was only there at that turning point. The Spirit is constantly with us. That's the beauty of the Spirit. The Spirit doesn't sleep, doesn't eat, doesn't get tired, doesn't get aggravated. The Spirit is just there. See, just there. Excuse me. When I say just there, okay, yeah. I mean, not just in the sense that merely there. No, it's always there. You know, the sun is just beautiful. Yes, it's just beautiful. It's always beautiful. You may not be able to see it, but it's just beautiful. The Spirit is always there. Do we tap in? Can we tap in? Yes. Yes, we can. Whether we do or not, that's up to us. So I hesitate to say that the examen of conscience is a mandatory thing. It's not. You can get to heaven without doing the examen of conscience. But what you cannot do is you cannot ignore the Spirit and get to heaven. In some function, in some way, you have to come to grips with the Spirit in your life. You may not be reflective enough to name that Spirit, but you should be reflective enough to understand that it is or was the Spirit. So I'm saying it is an examen of conscience. It's a tool. It's not mandatory. It's not something that if you skip it, you should confess. No, no. We're not into morals. We're not into sin here. We're into habits. We're into procedures. We're into a way of living. I must say, I personally, the examen of conscience has been a great help to me. Ignatius is on record as saying, in the sight of Jesus, Jesuits are supposed to pray an hour every day and make the examen of conscience twice a day. And Ignatius is on record as saying, if you're so busy that you have to give up either the hour of prayer or the two examens, give up the hour of prayer. So in Ignatius's evaluation, it was the spirit of the examen which really carried you. Now, don't go out and say, Collins says don't pray. No, I'm not saying that. But there are times when you cannot pray. Just physically, you can't do it. You don't have time, you don't have place, you don't have circumstances. You can always make an examen. Always. It doesn't require deep preparation. It doesn't require a lot of time. It doesn't require special circumstances. It can be done anywhere. You can always make the examen, whereas you cannot always pray. This is not contradictory. Finding God in all things is the motto of the Society of Jesus. And it's through the examen that we get to this, I think. That we find God in all things if we're looking at all things. And that's the critical thing. And that's what the examen does. It looks at all things. It looks at our relationship with other people. It looks at our relationship with God. It looks at our relationship to self. And it looks through all the circumstances we find ourselves in the humdrum daily life of just living, of existing, of being. The examen is very important, I think. Okay. I talked about the examination of consciousness. I personally, I'm not that convinced of that. Probably because I'm ignorant of it. I don't know how to do it very well. I was not brought up on the examen of consciousness. I was brought up on the examen of conscience. And so I feel much more at home with that. I can relate to that. On the other hand, the examination of consciousness seems to have an appeal to younger people. I'm an old man now. So younger people probably can relate to the examen of consciousness better than the old way of the examen of conscience. You get into conscience and you're talking about right and wrong. Good conscience, bad conscience. When I was in high school, all the football games were played on Friday nights. Well, this was pre-Vatican II. And in the United States, you were not allowed to eat meat on Friday. Well, if you go to a football game on a Friday night and they're serving hot dogs, you're not going to reflect on whether it's Friday or Thursday or Monday or Tuesday. You're going to have a hot dog. I remember once that I unthinkingly I had a hot dog at a football game, and a priest, one of the parish priests, he came up to me and he said, "You know, that's a mortal sin." I didn't know what he's talking about. I said, "What's that, Father?" He said, "This is Friday and you're eating a hot dog." Ah, yes. Well, you know, I was a young teenage boy. I was scarred, as it were. But thank God I outlived it. And when you're into conscience, nobody can impose that upon you. And the examen of conscience is the same thing. When I make an examen of conscience and you make an examen of conscience, you and I may have had the same situation, met the same people, heard the same talk, we're in the same place. Our examen may be considerably different. It should be different. So it's not a matter of conscience in the sense of this is wrong and this is right and this is allowed and this is not allowed. No, it's a matter of what is the Spirit doing. I think it's important for all of us to get in touch with the Spirit. And once again, I reiterate, a prayer life is an absolute necessity for the examen of conscience. Without prayer, you cannot examine your conscience, at least in the Ignatian sense. You may be very good, as Ben Franklin was, at ticking off virtues and getting rid of habits. But it's not the examiner, it's not grasping what the Spirit is doing or saying or leading or pointing out in your life. So please don't make a mistake and attribute it to me that I say that the examen of consciousness is no good. No, it's very good, I'm sure. I just don't know how to use it. It's not for me. I'm too old. I'm too set in my ways, if you will. But the examen of conscience, as I understand it, as I tried to explain it, is very helpful. It puts me, the examiner, if you will, in the position of looking back on what happened. And it gives you a certain distance from that actually happened. You know, if you met somebody, say in the morning at class, in the university or school or at your workplace, and then at noon you reflected on that meeting, there's a certain aesthetic distance there which is required. And the Spirit bridges that very well if we're doing the examen of conscience. It gives you, you know, at the time you may have been very excited. You may have been angry. You may have been sad. You may have been hopeful. You may have been dejected. But if you get away from it in time and place, then the Spirit can work with you and does work with you. So I plump for the examen of conscience. I think it's a very good tool. Do I use it as best I can? No, I don't. Do I pray as well as I can? No, I don't. Do I want to use it? Yeah. Yeah. When a young boy wants to enter the society of Jesus, he puts himself forward and he has to sit for interviews with 4 Jesuit priests. The content of the interviews can be anything that priest decides. One question that must be asked, according to Ignatius, is, do you want to be a Jesuit? Well, the guy has come here with that in mind. It's kind of a stupid question. But Ignatius says 99% will look at it that way, a stupid question. 1% will pause and be honest and say, I don't know. He said, for that one person, what you want to do is say, do you want to be a Jesuit? That's the key. Do you want to want? Simply wanting can be a velleity. To want means that deep in your heart, this is what you're looking for. That's what the examen gets to. What really goes on in the spirit, in your heart. Anyway, you know, when I was still driving, we used to have I'm sure they have it now, almost every car now has the navigation system, you know? You get in, you punch in the telephone number or the address, and the direction is there. It's either vocally or a map. And the beauty of it is, if you make a mistake, it doesn't get mad at you. You know, if you're driving with somebody and he says turn left, and you why didn't you turn left, you know? But the navigation said that's the way the conscience works. That it points out you should have turned left, but you didn't. Okay, next time, turn right twice. That's what we have to get to, where we're at ease with the Spirit working in our lives. Again, this is where I would stop and take questions. But you're not questioning me. So I think we'll just call it. Sure, if you want to ask a question, huh?
Just to back up a few things, Father, that you said already. The difference, Father, I'd like to. Okay. I'd like to ask you. Excuse me. Yeah, just to back up a few minutes of what you've said. The difference, or is there a difference, prayer and examen of conscience?
Yes, there is a difference. As you know, prayer can be thanksgiving. Prayer can be a plea, an ask for grace. Prayer can be for pardon. Prayer can be... The examination of conscience is not asking for anything. The examination of conscience is simply reflecting the reality of what happened, what took place, how you felt. So in a sense, it's a form of prayer, obviously. But the distinction, I think, is when you're praying in the form of context of prayer, you are having input. In the examination of conscience, you are, in a sense, passive. The Spirit is having his or her, if you will, input. Now, I know there's prayer where you don't have input. You simply are there. The prayer is centering. Yes, but even there, you want to be careful because the examination of conscience, you are not the center. What happened to you is the center. And the Spirit points out what happened to you. In prayer, of course, you're not always the center, but let's be honest, often we are the center in prayer. What I want, what I desire, what I'm sorry for, what I'm thankful for, what I. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much.
I'll ask the question. Yes. Yes. So my question is, you said that the human being likes not like the human being does not prefer to be inside a box because we want our spontaneous life or we
Yeah.
want our independence.
Yes.
And here there is the spirit that is leading you towards something. The spirit also wants to work with you. So it's like working together, but at the same time you have your independence also. So I would like to know, since we have that independence with us, uh, there are sometimes we are satisfied with things that are happening, or there are sometimes we are happy with the things that are happening, and there are sometimes when we are dissatisfied with the things that are happening. These dissatisfactions or this happiness can happen without the examination itself. Like I may not be sitting separately and examining. It might be just naturally coming, oh, this is something I do not like, or this is something
Yeah.
So is the examen a time where you have to sit separately and do it, or is it something that can happen automatically to you when situations happen? So what
Yes,
do you have
yes.
to
What you say is true. That there will be satisfaction or dissatisfaction whether I examine it or not. What examine does, it adds that layer, if you will, that dimension of reflecting on it, of naming the dissatisfaction, of categorizing the satisfaction. That's why I brought up the free-floating anxiety. It can be just a nebulous something, it just doesn't sit well. Something's wrong today. The examen helps you specify it was this, or this, or this. That's where the examen is helpful. Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, it may be a little premature, but
There are more questions. Only we can ask questions.
yeah, that's the point.
We are the lucky ones.
That's the beauty of a wider audience. You get various.
Father, I would like to follow up the one of,
Yes.
for example, if I am able to point out during doing the examen of conscience, and then I could point out this is the reason why I felt anxious, I felt sad. What is the difference of this with the psychological thing?
Well, because you're not simply analyzing yourself as such. You're opening to the Spirit who analyzes you, and you tap into that. That's the point. That the examination of conscience, if you take the strict meaning of the word, the Spirit plays no role in that. That's why Ben Franklin could examine his conscience. But if it's examine of conscience in the Ignatian sense, what you're doing is you're inviting the Spirit, or you're reflecting upon the Spirit and his function in your life, in this meeting, in this situation. So it's more than simply ticking off good things or bad things. It's a meld of good and bad things in the Spirit, and therefore what happened in my soul, my head, my heart, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, Father, I don't know how this is relating to what you've just said, but examining the examination of conscience involves asking questions,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Okay, number one. Number two, an example. Okay, and I don't want to get too deep into the theology or doctrine or any of this, but Mary,
Mm-hmm.
Jesus' mother, is visited by Gabriel, and Gabriel announces that she will become the mother of God. Mary says, "How can this be?" Okay, and was Mary involved in is that an example, or is that related to an examen of consciousness? I'm not trying to get deep into theology here, but I wonder about that.
I don't know. Immediately after that, you have almost the exact situation with the father of John the Baptist, Zechariah. He's told by the angel, the same Gabriel, that his wife is going to give birth, and she's an old woman. And he said, "How can this be?" As a result, he was struck dumb. Why was Mary not struck dumb, and Zechariah was? Is it a whimsical God we're talking about? Is he for women against men? You could construe this. But the point is, I think both of them were being honest. If I am told that I'm going to be the father of a child and I've never had sexual intercourse, the perfectly legitimate question, how can this be? In Mary's case, she was told, look, the Holy Spirit has done this. Don't be afraid. Nurture this child. Give it birth. It's going to be great. But Zechariah was told, because you didn't believe, until it happens, you're not going to be able to speak. Why? I don't know why. Was Mary honest? Yes. Was Zechariah honest? Yes. Was Mary right? Yes. Was Zechariah right? Yes. Why was Zechariah punished? I don't know. Why was Mary not punished? I don't know.
Does it relate to Mary's Immaculate Conception?
I guess it does, yeah. I guess it does. But it was clearly she was in doubt, which brings up a completely different subject. But doubt in our lives can be a very important thing. Certainty is great, but unfortunately doubt is more prevalent. How do we handle doubt? But that's a brand new topic. Yeah.
It's not a question actually, Father, but I could see very well now how important the examination of conscience, the examen, how important, very important in our spiritual life, because it's one way of how do you call this, relating with the Spirit, or being open to the Spirit, no?
Yes.
Who is always with us.
Yes.
And we don't know that. We are not conscious of His presence.
Yes.
But if we have the examination of conscience, which I could see now I do it, but I didn't know that it's more important than my 1 hour of prayer. I do the same thing, 1 hour prayer and examination of conscience.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that St. Ignatius put so much emphasis to the importance of the examination of conscience. I think it's very important in that sense that we get in touch with the Holy Spirit, in touch in God. No, of course in prayer too. That's why the examen of conscience should be done in prayer. If we don't have the life of prayer, we cannot do it. So spontaneously you can do it, like what Royston was saying, that anywhere, anytime we have the freedom, no? That independence that you said.
Yeah.
And it comes from time to time as a Christian, or not even a Christian. What happened? I was so mad. Yeah. And what happened there,
Yeah.
So it's like the examination of conscience, but many people don't know that it's examination of conscience. But for us Christians, we are blessed because we know we can get in touch with the Spirit, and the Spirit will help us and guide us.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it's
well,
so
it is
wonderful.
true.
Thank you so much for the beautiful talk
You're
today.
welcome. You're welcome.
Okay, yeah, we're going to end now, okay? And we want to thank you, Father Collins, very much for this time, this place, this topic. We're all blessed to have received this. I think the Spirit's here, and you help bring the Spirit, Father. And I hope that we can take the Spirit out into the world and work it there. So yeah, just to follow up what Adelpha was saying, it's so important, and great way to end this year, this challenging year, and to go into a new year. So again, thank you very much, Father. And we'd also like to thank Father Boney and Sister Flor, Sister Lenny, Adelpha, Royston and the dynamic St. Ignatius Youth Ministry for all their support efforts in making this a reality, and a very worthwhile Christ-centered reality. So thank everybody for that. And on that note, we will stop and examine our conscience. And, sorry? And, yeah, thank you, Adelpha. And, yeah, we wish all of you a blessed, Christ-centered New Year. And now I know what my New Year's resolution is going to be. Guess what, Father? Examine our conscience. Examine my conscience, okay? Again, thank you so much, Father Collins, for this time.
You're welcome.
And for all your efforts. And you be well. We pray for you constantly.
Thank you.
And
Thank
all
you
the
very
good
much.
Jesuit fathers,
Good.
okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.